This brings us to the last section where basically I want to talk about return on investment. In particular, I want to explain, we've all heard technology, processes, and people. I want to talk about how the advantage with AI is driven in today's world, not by adopting Copilot. So I want to be really clear, like everyone in this call, everyone across all industries is going to use digital assistants like Copilot or Google. Like it's going to be Microsoft or Google. Anyway, so there's a longer discussion to explain why, but fundamentally you're going to use one of those tools, right? And when you use, depending on which stack you are, right? So Google's what, 46%, no, 44% of the market or something. Microsoft's 47% of the market. So you're going to use one of those two tools. Google obviously much more pronounced in SMB and smaller organizations. Now, if we look at Microsoft, then what we want to do is we want to drive success where we have a competitive advantage versus somebody else. If we're all benefiting from AI being enhanced in our capital P processes and our capital P systems, then those are things like ERP systems, CRM or customer experience systems, employee experience systems. All of those systems are going to be improved where AI becomes enriched and embedded in them from any vendor. It doesn't matter who the vendor is. And so that means all boats are lifted, right? Because everyone who has those licenses or use those tools, as long as they're modern and modernized in their infrastructure, are going to benefit from that experience. So that's not a competitive advantage. The competitive advantage is when you do something different than your competitors in your industry. And that is driven by people and processes, right? And maybe data, like the quality of your data and its usage. So people and processes are the lowercase p processes that bridge between these systems. And that is where a lot of the ROI and the technical readiness is really important to understand, because that's where low code and Power Platform has worked. That's where a lot of the stuff we've already been doing in the IT space and technical team space has been having some big impact. So it's not really different with AI. It's just an exponential curve, which means we need to be more accelerated in our approach. Excuse me. We can't ignore it like we could with low code to a degree, or defer it, because the benefit from an organization that's getting 300% return on investment, or 200+% return on investment, and 200% productivity gains and 40% quality gains is going to just beat you in every category if you're not able to compete, right? And the baseline is going to give you, like I said, 60 to 120% productivity. It's going to give you some benefits, but it's not going to give you the real benefit longer term. So think of this like a graph. So this is what happens when we do effective, we do all these technical readiness, we do it all right. This is what it looks like, right? We get some return on investment on our Microsoft Copilot investment. And as you scale the investment, right, that means more licensing, more people, then you're going to get it's not a flat line, but you're going to get a relatively consistent return on investment. When you start to deal with things like adoption, you're going to see, if not an exponential, certainly an accelerated curve of benefit and return on investment with adoption. Now, this is going to be the whole focus of the business readiness discussion, so I'm going to skip over it for now. But keep in mind, technical teams and technical readiness has an impact on, of course, adoption and business readiness. The other thing is technical teams spend a lot of time on data optimization and integration. I've already mentioned it a number of ways, but this is a tax you pay in order to get the benefits of process automation. So think of this as, you do this work because we want to make sure we can use Copilot effectively and responsibly, right? So we can continue to scale and not worry. So we can continue to drive better adoption. And most importantly, perhaps, so that we can automate scenarios with plugins and other capabilities where we bring AI in the flow, especially with functional agents in the flow of work, and that drives a much, much more pronounced return on investment. We believe, and this is early stage, because again, we only have about a year and a half of data, if we're being real, because we've only had preview customers, for so much time with Copilot. What we're seeing right now is we think that this section is the most exponential of these curves. And this brings us to a broader discussion, right? If we can get 2x return, it means you need to spend time and money on plugins and things like that from the very beginning, because that's where almost all of the real strong ROI is. And of course, adoption, which we'll talk about in the business one, is really important as well. But another way to think about this is, if we think about a curve, what we see ahead of us is this exponential curve from AI. It's a exponential technology shift, not a linear one. So it's not like steps, like incremental changes in technology. It's an exponential curve. So we had something very similar to this in the pandemic. In the pandemic, we essentially had we all knew hybrid work mattered. We needed to do the investments. What happened is we got to a point where, for hybrid work, all of a sudden the pandemic happened, and it was like hitting a wall, where all of us had to do digital first response and move almost vertically up for a period of time in terms of IT performance and success and efficacy. And then thank God it kind of plateaued after the pandemic, once we achieved certain levels of hybrid work, et cetera, it then kind of plateaued and went back to more linear progression. However, this is like the pandemic, except it doesn't end. This is what's coming ahead of us. So think of it like a line. What we're doing is we're bridging the gap with, technical leadership, with adoption, with a bunch of different things, right? At change management. So what we're doing is we're bridging the gap. The longer we wait to bridge that gap, the more vertical that line has to be. The more opportunity is missed and return on investment is missed, and also the more expensive and challenging it is for us to address it. So this is why it's so important in 2024. We're like mid-year now. By the end of the year, I would suggest for most organizations, optimally, you want to be around the D in this exponential curve, or at least halfway there. So again, in 2025, we are on the real exponential, the hockey stick type explosion is happening with something called functional agents. That's what 2025 is going to be about, not digital assistants. That's what Copilot is today. It's basically a digital assistant. What we're going to be doing is something very different. So it's really critical in the next 6 months for us to do this much faster, because if we're not already there, it's going to be really hard for us to scale up in the pathways that we want. If you thought the pandemic was hard, this is much harder because it doesn't end like the previous one before it. So those explain a little bit more of what I'm mentioning, service model and other things like that. It's really important to understand those implications. Now, just in case, I want to give you some tools yourself to share with your own teams. So this is our best representation of what we mean by this change. You have foundational value driven by modern AI enablement. That's what we've been talking about today. Technical readiness, enablement, so that we can responsibly enable Copilot for Microsoft 365. And that allows us to start scaling digital assistants in our organization, which gives us a differentiated value because, as I mentioned, the real maximized ROI and competitive advantage is when your lowercase p processes are AI enriched, and that is exactly what digital assistants like Copilot for Microsoft 365 do. So really great, because these two things are very achievable with everything we've talked about today. But I promise in 2025, we're going to start getting into things like functional agents. And because that's going to happen, you need to start preparing now for an acceleration in that curve. The other thing is a lot of IT leaders and business leaders I talk to think it looks like this, where they're doing a lot of investment now, and then they'll kind of be able to taper off investments over time. That is not how it works. The triangle is inverted. Right now, we're doing modern AI enablement so that we can spend more money next year and scale the way Copilot and these tools work, because the return on investment is insane. And then we're going to scale that even further, exponentially most likely, to the functional agent value and exponential value that you get from Copilot. So this also explains why not just do we need to get started sooner rather than later, but we need to do this in the right way, because this is essentially how the whole balance is going to be based. And if we don't start to pay those security debts and governance debts and model debts now, then you're going to feel it much worse in a year from now when your competitors are starting to advance in more of an exponential track and you're still working on this linear pathway. So really important stuff. I'm hoping some of the language I used here, as well as some of those visuals, will help you communicate this internally. So today we're preparing our organizations for an exponential curve. It's different than linear curves. It's too important to leave in the hands of technologists. As I mentioned, we're going to have a business readiness discussion. So that's really important. And the sooner we embrace and scale and start scaling, the better off we'll be. All right, so that's what I came here to say. Let me give you a couple other pieces of advice. There's a business readiness webinar. I've talked about it lots. That's coming up. I also would encourage you to start learning. The more you can educate yourself, the better off you'll be. So there's some technical readiness links here that I'll put in the slide deck that you'll have access to, as well as in the recording. I do encourage you to take a look at these things. In addition to that, thank you so much for your time. In addition to that, we also have a white paper that's really popular around that Viva stuff. So if you don't want to go watch, 4 hours plus of video content around Copilot and Viva, I encourage you to take a look at this 100+ page white paper that talks about how Viva and Microsoft 365 as well as Copilot are changing employee experience, because we do find that complements a lot of what we talked about today.